On June 3, 2015, Judge Chantel Fortuyn sentenced a man to 7 life terms plus 175 years in prison. George Thomas had been convicted of orchestrating multiple murders while locked in solitary confinement. The paradox wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Maximum security hadn't stopped him from running a criminal empire. 6 state witnesses died during the 4-year trial, each one eliminated before they could testify. The question wasn't whether Thomas had the reach to kill from behind bars. The question was how the prison system had become an extension of his command structure rather than a barrier to it. The courtroom that day was packed with police, prosecutors, family members of victims, and journalists who had followed the case through years of delays and intimidation. Thomas sat in the dock, his expression unreadable as the judge read through conviction after conviction. 7 counts of murder, multiple counts of conspiracy, racketeering charges under legislation specifically designed to target organized crime. The proceedings had stretched across 4 years, longer than most murder trials because the evidence wasn't just about specific acts of violence. It was about proving that Thomas managed an entire criminal enterprise from behind bars, that his orders flowed from a solitary cell to the streets of Cape Town where they were executed with precision. But even as the sentence was handed down, investigators and prosecutors understood that the trial had only addressed part of the problem. Thomas's conviction didn't dismantle the 28's numbers gang. It didn't eliminate the networks of loyalty and fear that sustained the organization. And it didn't resolve the deeper issue that would emerge 7 years later in a different courtroom, when another judge would reveal evidence that the 28's had successfully infiltrated the highest levels of provincial law enforcement. The removal of one general, no matter how powerful, couldn't undo institutional capture that had taken years to establish. George Thomas didn't invent the 28's. He inherited a system that had been refining itself since the late 1800s, when South African prisons became laboratories for a different kind of social order. The numbers gang emerged as 3 distinct factions, each with a specialized function that mirrored a governmental structure. The 26's handled wealth accumulation through smuggling, gambling, and narcotics distribution. They operated during daylight hours, managing the logistics of an underground economy that moved cash, drugs, and contraband through prison walls and township streets. Known as the Men of the Sun, they were the economic engine that generated revenue for all 3 factions. The 27 served as enforcers of gang law, positioned between the money men and the warriors to mediate disputes and execute judgments. When internal conflicts arose or when someone violated the code, the 27's determined consequences. Their role was judicial and administrative, maintaining the internal rules that governed how the number operated. They also handled specific acts of violence against prison warders, assassinations that sent messages about the limits of state authority inside correctional facilities. The 27's occupied the middle position in the hierarchy, translating between economic operations and military force. The 28's were the military wing, the men of the night responsible for protecting the Brotherhood's interests and waging war against threats from outside or within. Their function was territorial defense and the execution of strategic violence. When someone needed to be eliminated, when a rival gang challenged 28's control over a neighborhood or a prison block, the warriors of the 28's carried out the response. They weren't merely enforcers, they were the armed wing of an organization that functioned like a shadow state within the formal boundaries of South Africa. Thomas rose through the 28's to the rank of general, a position that placed him above the binary structure of the gold line and silver line. The gold line consisted of the warrior class, the soldiers who carried out physical violence and defended gang territory. These were the men who conducted hits, protected gang operations from police interference, and fought rival organizations for control of lucrative criminal markets. The silver line managed the social hierarchy within the prison system, maintaining discipline through a regimented structure that included coerced sexual relationships known as the Wi-Fi system. Younger or vulnerable members were forced into subordinate positions, creating a social order that reinforced loyalty through both fear and the promise of eventual advancement. A general commanded both lines, wielding influence that extended beyond military operations into the cultural fabric of prison life. The rank was for life. Once achieved, it couldn't be stripped away by incarceration or isolation. This permanence meant that even if a general was locked in solitary confinement or transferred to a different facility, his authority within the numbers gang remained intact. The title carried weight that transcended physical location. Orders from a general were absolute, backed by decades of ritual and tradition that elevated obedience to a religious principle. The numbers gang's structure wasn't arbitrary. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to build a resilient organization that could survive the removal of individual members. Each faction had redundancy built into its leadership. Each rank had specific responsibilities and privileges defined by the code. New members underwent initiation ceremonies that reinforced loyalty to the number above all other allegiances, including family ties and ethnic identity. The gang became a total institution, providing identity, protection, and purpose in exchange for absolute commitment. Thomas's strongholds were Bishop Lavis and Valhalla Park, townships on the Cape Flats where his authority often eclipsed that of local government. These areas weren't chosen randomly. The Cape Flats had been shaped by the Group Areas Act, legislation that forcibly removed colored communities from central Cape Town to peripheral zones where population density met economic scarcity. The forced removals that began in the 1960s and continued through the 1970s created concentrated poverty in specific geographic areas, stripping communities of the economic infrastructure and social networks they had built over generations. In these environments, gangs didn't emerge as criminal organizations operating in defiance of the state. They emerged as alternative governance structures, providing protection, employment, and identity in spaces where the state had deliberately withdrawn resources. When police presence was minimal and economic opportunities were non-existent, the gang offered a path to income and status. When family structures collapsed under the pressure of unemployment and forced migration, the gang provided brotherhood and belonging. The numbers gang filled the vacuum left by state failure, not as a temporary expedient, but as a permanent fixture of township life. Bishop Lavis became a territory where 28's authority was absolute. Residents understood that certain streets belonged to the gang, that certain conflicts would be resolved through gang mediation rather than police intervention, that operating a business or even living safely required some degree of accommodation with the organization. This wasn't passive acceptance. It was practical recognition of where real power resided. The gang could offer protection from rival organizations and from common criminals who might otherwise prey on vulnerable residents. But that protection came with expectations of silence, cooperation, and tribute. Between 2006 and 2010, Thomas consolidated control through a series of murders that prosecutors would later call the Bishop Lavis murder spree. Rivals were eliminated systematically. Witnesses who might testify about gang operations disappeared or were found dead. The pattern was deliberate enough that when investigators finally built their case, they could trace a direct line from each killing back to Thomas's network of subordinates. But Thomas himself rarely touched a weapon. His power lay in the architecture of command, in the layers of loyalty that insulated him from direct participation while ensuring his orders were executed with precision. The murders during this period weren't random acts of violence. Each one served a strategic purpose within the gang's operations. A rival dealer encroaching on 28's territory would be killed as a warning to others. A witness preparing to cooperate with police would be eliminated before their testimony could damage the organization. A member suspected of disloyalty would be executed to reinforce the code's absolute nature. The violence was calculated, deployed as a management tool to maintain control over criminal markets and ensure internal discipline. Pollsmoor Prison functioned as the capital of the numbers gang, the place where internal laws and rituals were most intensely enforced. The prison wasn't a barrier to Thomas's influence, it was the foundation of it. Inside Pollsmoor, the gang's social order operated with the discipline of a military unit and the rituals of a religious sect. New members underwent initiation ceremonies that involved both physical ordeals and the recitation of the gang's origin stories. These rituals weren't theatrical performances. They were mechanisms of indoctrination that transformed individual identity into collective membership. The code was absolute. Breaking it meant death, whether the violation occurred inside the prison or on the outside. Members who cooperated with authorities, who stole from the gang, or who showed disrespect to superiors faced execution. The punishment wasn't negotiable. The code existed to ensure that loyalty superseded self-interest, that members understood the consequences of betrayal with absolute clarity. This rigidity created an organization where orders flowed downward without question and information flowed upward without distortion. Prison itself became a recruiting ground rather than a deterrent. Young men arrested for minor crimes entered facilities like Polesmore and encountered the numbers gang as the dominant social structure. Joining offered protection from other inmates and from the violence that permeated South African prisons. It offered identity in an environment designed to strip away individuality. And it offered the possibility of status and income upon release, as gang membership provided connections to criminal networks on the outside. The correctional system, meant to rehabilitate and isolate criminals, instead functioned as a training academy for organized crime. The 28s under Thomas operated multiple revenue streams, each one tied to a different sector of the Cape Flats economy. Methamphetamine distribution became a primary driver, with the drug known locally as tick flooding Bishop Lavis and surrounding townships. The introduction of high-purity methamphetamine wasn't a side effect of gang activity. It was a deliberate business decision that generated enormous profits while creating dependency in communities already struggling with unemployment and social fragmentation. The methamphetamine trade operated through a tiered distribution system. The gang imported or manufactured the drug, then distributed it through a network of street-level dealers who paid tribute up the chain. Each dealer controlled a specific territory, protected by the gang's military capacity from rivals who might try to move in. Customers who couldn't pay in cash could be recruited as lookouts, runners, or enforcers, expanding the gang's operational capacity while deepening community entanglement in the criminal economy. The drug didn't just generate revenue, it created dependency relationships that strengthened the gang's control over entire neighborhoods. The social cost was measurable and devastating. Addiction rates surged in areas where tick became widely available. Domestic violence increased as users experienced the paranoia and aggression associated with methamphetamine abuse. Family structures collapsed when parents became addicts, or when the need to finance addiction drove members into crime. Children grew up in households where the drug was a constant presence, normalizing its use and creating pathways for the next generation to enter the same markets. The gang's economic success was built directly on the destruction of the communities it claimed to protect. Abalone poaching represented another lucrative operation. The marine mollusk commanded high prices in Asian export markets, particularly in China where abalone was prized for traditional cuisine and medicinal uses. Organized poaching networks stripped the Western Cape coastline to supply that demand, diving illegally in protected areas and harvesting mollusks faster than populations could regenerate. The operation required boats, diving equipment, processing facilities, and smuggling networks to move the product from South African waters to international buyers. The profits funded weaponry and paid off officials who might otherwise interfere with gang operations. Abalone poaching generated cash that could be laundered through legitimate businesses or used to purchase high-grade firearms from international arms dealers. The environmental destruction was irrelevant to the balance sheet. What mattered was the conversion of a natural resource into cash that could be moved through the system and distributed to those who maintained the organization's power. By the time marine biologists documented the ecological collapse of abalone populations, the gang had already extracted millions of rand in value. The taxi industry offered a different kind of opportunity, one tied to infrastructure rather than commodities. As South Africa's Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, known as PRASA, saw its services decline through mismanagement and infrastructure collapse, commuters shifted to minibus taxis for transportation. Rail lines that had once moved thousands of workers daily from the Cape Flats to central Cape Town deteriorated to the point of uselessness. Copper cable theft, vandalism, and maintenance failures turned a public service into a broken system that couldn't compete with private minibus operators. The 28s recognized the strategic value of controlling taxi routes and associations. Violence erupted as different gangs fought for dominance over shifting commuter patterns. The so-called taxi wars weren't turf battles over symbolic territory. They were business disputes over logistics, infrastructure, fought with the same military capacity the gangs had developed for narcotics distribution and territorial defense. Control over a taxi route meant recurring income from drivers who paid daily fees to the association. It meant the ability to dictate which operators could service which areas, and it meant leverage over communities that depended on the taxis for basic mobility. The shift from rail to taxi transport also created opportunities for extortion beyond the taxi industry itself. Small businesses located near taxi ranks became targets for protection payments. Informal traders who relied on commuter foot traffic had to negotiate with gangs that controlled access to profitable locations. The gang's economic model expanded from supplying illegal commodities to taxing legitimate economic activity, a transition that made the organization more resilient to law enforcement efforts focused on drug interdiction or specific criminal markets. Prosecuting George Thomas required a legal framework that could reach past the layers of subordinates who executed his orders. Traditional criminal law struggled with gang hierarchies because leaders like Thomas rarely participated directly in the commission of crimes. He didn't pull triggers, he didn't transport drugs, he didn't collect protection money at gunpoint. His role was strategic and managerial, issuing orders that flowed down through the command structure to the soldiers who carried out the actual violence. The Prevention of Organized Crime Act changed that calculation. POCA allowed prosecutors to charge Thomas with managing a criminal enterprise, making him legally responsible for the actions of his soldiers even when he hadn't pulled a trigger or delivered a package himself. The legislation recognized that modern organized crime operated through hierarchies designed to insulate leaders from direct culpability. By criminalizing the management of such enterprises, POCA gave prosecutors a tool to target the architects of criminal operations, rather than just the foot soldiers. The trial lasted over 4 years, from the initial charges in 2010 to the final sentencing in June 2015. Judge Fortuyn's eventual judgment ran to 800 pages, detailing Thomas's role in orchestrating murders while held in conditions that were supposed to prevent exactly that kind of communication. The prosecution built its case through documentary evidence, witness testimony, and the testimony of gang members who had turned state witness in exchange for reduced sentences. Each piece of evidence had to withstand challenges from defense attorneys who argued that the state was relying on unreliable witnesses with motives to fabricate testimony. The evidence revealed a systematic failure in the correctional system's ability to isolate high-profile prisoners. Correctional staff, terrified of Thomas's reach, facilitated the smuggling of cell phones into his cell. With those devices, Thomas issued green lights, assassination orders, that were carried out on the streets of Cape Town while he sat in maximum security. The phones weren't smuggled once or twice. They were a regular feature of his incarceration, replaced whenever authorities discovered and confiscated them. Guards who refused to cooperate faced threats not just to themselves, but to their families. The gang's intelligence network could identify where guards lived, where their children went to school, what routes they took to and from work. The murder of state witnesses during the trial exposed the vulnerabilities of South Africa's witness protection system. 6 people who had agreed to testify were killed before they could appear in court. Each death narrowed the prosecution's case, forcing them to rely more heavily on documentary evidence and the testimony of witnesses who survived long enough to give statements. The pattern suggested something more organized than isolated hits. It suggested a coordinated effort to identify witnesses despite protective measures, locate them across different cities and provinces, and eliminate them in ways that sent unmistakable messages to anyone else considering cooperation with authorities. One witness was shot outside his home in the early morning hours. Another disappeared and was found weeks later in a shallow grave. A third was killed in what appeared to be a random robbery, but investigators found evidence linking the shooters to the 28's network. Each murder demonstrated the gang's reach and its commitment to preventing testimony that could damage Thomas's defense. The killings also revealed failures in the witness protection program, which struggled to relocate witnesses convincingly or provide adequate security for those who remained in their communities. The prosecution pressed forward despite the intimidation. Prosecutors who worked on the case received their own security details after intelligence suggested they were being targeted. Police investigators assigned to the case took precautions with their movements, varying routes and schedules to reduce predictability. The entire trial became a test of whether the state could protect those who participated in the justice system from a criminal organization that had demonstrated its willingness to kill anyone who threatened its interests. When the verdict finally came, it was comprehensive. Thomas was convicted on 7 counts of murder, each one linked to the Bishop Lavis murder spree between 2006 and 2010. He was also convicted of racketeering under Poaching, the charge that made him legally responsible for managing the 28's criminal enterprise. The sentence, 7 life terms plus 175 years for additional offenses, ensured he would never be released. But the victory was partial. The trial had consumed enormous resources and years of effort to convict one man. The 28's organization continued to operate. New leaders stepped into management roles. The institutional corruption that had allowed Thomas to command from solitary confinement remained unaddressed. On October 17, 2022, Judge Daniel Thullare issued a judgment in a separate case involving Elcardo Adams and Alfonso Cloete, 2 figures linked to the 28's. The judgment didn't focus primarily on the defendant's crimes. It focused on evidence that the 28's had successfully infiltrated senior management of the South African Police Service in the Western Cape. The term Thullare used was capture. The gang had gained access to the table where the provincial commissioner and senior managers discussed crime intelligence and policing strategies. The infiltration manifested in multiple ways, each one representing a catastrophic breach of institutional integrity. Gang leaders received advance warning of planned police raids, allowing them to relocate drugs, weapons, or personnel before law enforcement arrived. Operations that should have resulted in significant seizures and arrests instead found empty stash houses and abandoned vehicles. The pattern was too consistent to be explained by luck or by lower-level informants. Someone with access to operational planning was providing detailed information to the gang. Electronic listening devices placed in gang-controlled vehicles were discovered and removed, suggesting that someone with access to surveillance operations was passing information to the targets of investigation. These weren't simple wiretaps that might be detected through routine counter-surveillance. They were sophisticated devices that required technical knowledge to locate. The gang's ability to find and neutralize them pointed to intelligence coming from within law enforcement agencies that had deployed the equipment. Corrupt officers didn't just provide tips. They utilized police resources to transport contraband, effectively giving the 28's a state-sponsored logistics network. Vehicles marked as police property were used to move drugs and weapons, protected from routine traffic stops by their official status. Evidence storage facilities were compromised, with items disappearing from supposedly secure locations. The gang gained access not just to information, but to the material infrastructure of law enforcement. The gang actively targeted prosecutors and investigating officers, using police intelligence to identify home addresses and movement patterns. This wasn't opportunistic violence. It was systematic intimidation, backed by information that should have been protected within law enforcement channels. Prosecutors who worked on gang cases found themselves under surveillance by the very organization they were prosecuting. Their homes were watched, their families were photographed. The message was clear. Cooperation with the justice system came with personal risk that the state couldn't fully mitigate. Evidence also suggested coordination between police and gang members to engineer arrests of rivals, who would then be murdered within the prison system where the 28's controlled the internal hierarchy. This represented a particularly sinister form of corruption, using state power not to enforce the law, but to eliminate competitors on behalf of a criminal organization. Arrests that should have protected the public instead delivered victims to gang executioners operating inside supposedly secure facilities. Judge Thullare's judgment didn't simply document these failures, it quantified the risk. The court found that prosecutors and investigators working on gang cases were in active danger, not from external threats but from elements within their own institutions. The judgment recommended immediate steps to identify and remove compromised officers, to reform intelligence sharing protocols, and to establish independent oversight mechanisms that could detect corruption before it undermined entire investigations. Premier Alan Winde requested that the Western Cape Police Ombudsman investigate the alleged links between SAPs and the gangs. The investigation concluded in 2025, but the full report wasn't released to the public. Winde cited risks to the lives of police officers who had cooperated with the inquiry, arguing that disclosure could expose them to retaliation. The decision fueled speculation about the extent of the corruption. How many senior officials remained on the 28's payroll? Had provincial police management been successfully purged, or did the capture persist in less visible forms? The withholding of the report created a credibility problem for institutions trying to restore public trust. Communities in the Cape Flats had long suspected that police were compromised by gang influence. The Thular judgment confirmed those suspicions at the highest levels, but without transparency about what had been done to address the problem, the public had no way to assess whether reforms were genuine or cosmetic. Each delayed disclosure reinforced the perception that officials were protecting their own rather than confronting institutional failures. The Independent Police Investigative Directorate confirmed it was conducting its own probes into the extent of 28's infiltration. IPID operates independently of SAPS, investigating police misconduct and corruption with the authority to recommend criminal charges. But IPD investigations move slowly, constrained by limited resources and the difficulty of building cases against officers who understand investigative techniques and can deploy countermeasures. As of early 2025, no major prosecutions had resulted from the investigations Thulari's judgment had prompted. On August 6, 2024, news broke that George Thomas was being transferred from Kagoshi Mampuru II prison in Pretoria back to Helderstrom prison near Cape Town. The announcement triggered immediate concern in the Western Cape. Helderstrom sat in the heart of Thomas's former territory, close enough to Bishop Levis and Valhalla Park that his mere physical presence in the region could reactivate networks of loyalty and violence that had been dormant during his years of isolation in Pretoria, thousands of kilometers from the Cape Flats. Community leaders in the Western Cape expressed alarm publicly. They argued that returning Thomas to the province would destabilize areas where gang violence had decreased since his removal. Local media coverage amplified the concerns, framing the transfer as a potential disaster for communities still struggling with the legacy of gang control. Politicians from opposition parties questioned the decision, demanding explanations for why such a high-profile prisoner would be moved closer to his operational base. Minister of Correctional Services Peter Groenewald intervened, blocking the transfer and ordering that Thomas remain at Kagoshi Mampuru II. The justification was straightforward. Moving Thomas back to the Western Cape posed an unacceptable risk to public safety and institutional integrity. Groenewald's statement emphasized that the decision had been made after consultation with security officials who assessed the potential consequences of relocating a gang general to his home territory. But the controversy revealed something deeper about the nature of Thomas's power. Distance mattered. Geography wasn't just the backdrop to gang operations, it was a functional component of control. A general's ability to maintain influence depended partly on proximity to the networks and lieutenants who executed orders on the ground. Pretoria was far enough from Cape Town that Thomas's day-to-day influence over 28's operations had necessarily diminished. Communications were harder to maintain. The personal relationships that sustained loyalty became strained by physical separation. New leaders in the Western Cape had developed their own power bases, making decisions without waiting for approval from a general locked away in another province. Returning Thomas to Helderstrom would have reversed that dynamic. His presence in the Western Cape would have reasserted his authority over subordinates who had grown accustomed to operating independently. It would have allowed him to rebuild the direct communication channels that distance had disrupted, and it would have sent a symbolic message to the broader gang hierarchy. The general was back, and the old order could be restored. The attempted transfer also raised questions about decision-making within the Department of Correctional Services. Who had approved the initial move? What criteria had been used to justify relocating one of the country's most notorious gang leaders back to the region where his organization had captured elements of law enforcement? The answers weren't publicly disclosed, but the episode demonstrated that even years after conviction, Thomas remained a figure whose movements required ministerial intervention. Some observers suggested that the transfer had been proposed for administrative reasons unrelated to security considerations. Prison overcrowding, management of high-security inmates, or routine rotations might have motivated the decision without anyone adequately assessing the risks specific to Thomas's case. Others speculated that the transfer was itself evidence of continued gang influence within the correctional system, an attempt by compromised officials to move Thomas closer to his networks. Without transparency about the decision-making process, both explanations remained possible. One persistent misconception about high-security incarceration is that solitary confinement neutralizes a gang leader's ability to command. Thomas's case proved the opposite. Isolation can enhance mystique, transforming a leader into a symbolic figure whose absence from the streets amplifies his authority rather than diminishing it. The physical separation from day-to-day operations creates space for subordinates to interpret and execute the leader's will, often with more violence than the leader might have ordered directly. The dynamic works because absence removes the leader from mundane decisions and petty disputes that could undermine his status. Subordinates who see a general dealing with logistics problems or mediating minor conflicts might begin to view him as an administrator rather than a warrior. But a general locked in solitary confinement becomes mythic, reduced to his most essential qualities in the stories told about him. His past violence gets amplified in the retelling. His strategic decisions get credited with foresight they may not have possessed in the moment. The legend grows in ways that physical presence would constrain. More practically, solitary confinement only works if the walls actually isolate. Thomas's ability to issue orders from inside maximum security depended on corrupted guards who smuggled cell phones and other communication devices into his cell. Correctional staff faced a choice: uphold institutional rules and risk retaliation from an organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill state employees, or facilitate the gang's operations and receive protection or payment in return. The evidence suggests many chose the latter. Guards who cooperated with Thomas weren't necessarily ideologically aligned with the gang. Many were simply terrified. They had families living in townships where the 28s operated. They traveled to and from work on routes the gang controlled. Refusing a request to smuggle a phone might mean a visit from gang members who knew where the guards' children went to school. The choice between institutional duty and personal safety wasn't abstract. It was immediate and visceral. The payment structure reinforced cooperation. Guards who smuggled phones or other contraband received cash payments that exceeded their legitimate salaries. Over time, financial dependency developed alongside fear. Guard who had accepted money once found it harder to refuse the next request, knowing that refusal might not only end the income stream, but also provoke retaliation for past cooperation. The corruption became self-reinforcing, trapping guards in relationships with the gang that grew more entangled the longer they continued. The romanticized image of the gang leader as community protector also warps analysis of figures like Thomas. Some narratives frame gang bosses as Robin Hood figures who provide for the poor where the state fails, offering employment and protection in forgotten townships. The evidence from Bishop Lavis tells a different story. The 28s under Thomas introduced high-purity methamphetamine into communities already struggling with poverty and unemployment. The resulting addiction epidemic destroyed families and fueled gender-based violence. The protection offered was primarily an extortion mechanism, ensuring local silence and compliance rather than genuine welfare. Businesses that paid protection money to the gang weren't being safeguarded from external threats. They were being allowed to operate without harassment from the gang itself. Residents who cooperated with gang demands weren't receiving benevolent assistance. They were avoiding becoming targets. The transactional nature of the relationship was obvious to anyone living under gang control, even if outsiders sometimes misread submission as consensual partnership. Since Thomas's relocation to Pretoria, debate has persisted about the current leadership structure of the 28s. Within the numbers gang system, a general's rank is for life. Thomas hasn't been demoted or expelled from the organization. The code doesn't provide mechanisms for removing a general except through death. But physical distance from the Cape Flats limits his ability to manage daily operations in ways that raise practical questions about command authority. The 2022 Thulare judgment referenced Elcardo Adams and Alfonso Cloet as figures who had assumed street-level management duties previously overseen by Thomas. Whether they operate under his overall strategic direction or have established a decentralized leadership model remains unclear. Adams and Cloet were both convicted in the case that produced Thulare's judgment, but the sentences they received didn't remove them permanently from circulation. The possibility exists that they continue to coordinate 28's operations even while serving time, using the same corrupted communication channels that Thomas once exploited. This uncertainty matters for law enforcement strategy. If Thomas still provides overall orders from Pretoria, then disrupting his communication channels could fracture the organization's command structure, isolating him more effectively, preventing cell phone smuggling, and prosecuting guards who facilitate his contact with the outside world would target the central node of gang leadership. Resources invested in those efforts might yield significant returns in terms of organizational disruption. If leadership has decentralized, then removing Thomas, either through continued isolation or through targeting his ability to communicate, might have minimal impact on the gang's operations. A decentralized structure would be more resilient to the removal of any single figure, distributing authority across multiple leaders who could continue operating independently if one was taken out. The Numbers Gang has survived for more than a century by adapting its structure to changing conditions. Decentralized leadership could make the organization even more difficult to combat, even as it potentially reduces the cohesion that a single authoritative general provides. Some evidence suggests that the 28s have adopted a hybrid model. Thomas retains symbolic authority as a general whose rank is recognized throughout the organization. His approval might still be sought for major strategic decisions or for disputes that lower-level leaders can't resolve. But day-to-day operations, drug distribution, territory management, violence against rivals, are handled by regional leaders who have developed their own power bases and don't require constant direction from Pretoria. This model preserves the benefits of centralized authority while adapting to the reality of Thomas's physical isolation. It allows the organization to maintain continuity with its traditions and rituals while remaining operationally flexible. And it creates redundancy that protects the gang from law enforcement actions that successfully target individual leaders. If Adams is arrested, Cloete continues operating. If both are removed, other figures step into the vacuum because the structure itself persists independently of any particular personnel. Research into the relationship between public transportation and gang violence has revealed a correlation between the decline of PRASA rail services and the escalation of taxi-related conflicts. As commuter rail infrastructure deteriorated through mismanagement, maintenance failures, and cable theft, more residents of the Cape Flats shifted to minibus taxis for daily transportation. The decline wasn't sudden. It occurred over years as trains became increasingly unreliable, forcing commuters who depended on them for access to jobs in central Cape Town to find alternatives. The taxi industry became a contested space where gangs competed for control over routes and associations. Violence erupted as different organizations fought to dominate the expanding market. Shootings at taxi ranks, assassinations of rival operators, and attacks on drivers who refused to join specific associations became regular occurrences. The conflicts weren't random criminal violence. They were strategic battles over control of infrastructure that generated reliable income. This shift represents more than a change in revenue sources. It marks a transition from illicit commodities, drugs, weapons, contraband, to illicit control of public infrastructure. Taxing commuters or extorting taxi operators generates recurring income that's harder for law enforcement to disrupt than drug shipments or smuggling operations. A police raid can seize a drug shipment, but it can't seize control of a taxi route. An arrest can remove a drug dealer, but it can't eliminate the underlying economic logic that makes taxi extortion profitable. Infrastructure control also provides legitimacy in ways that drug dealing never can. A gang that dominates a taxi association can present itself as a business entity, providing transportation services, obscuring the violence and intimidation that maintain that dominance. Taxi operators who pay fees to the association might not even recognize those fees as extortion, especially if the association provides some actual services like route allocation or dispute mediation. The line between legitimate business operation and criminal enterprise blurs in ways that make prosecution more difficult. The degree to which this has permanently altered the 28's economic model is still being analyzed. Drug distribution remains profitable, and the methamphetamine market in the Western Cape hasn't disappeared. The tick epidemic continues to devastate communities where the 28s maintain influence, but the expansion into transportation suggests strategic thinking about sustainability and risk. Infrastructure control spreads revenue streams across multiple sectors, reducing vulnerability to enforcement actions that target specific commodities. It also integrates the gang more deeply into the daily economic life of communities, making it harder to isolate and dismantle. When a gang only sells drugs, residents can distance themselves by refusing to use or buy. When a gang controls the taxis people need to get to work, refusal isn't an option. The gang becomes embedded in the routine activities that sustain livelihoods, creating dependencies that go beyond addiction or criminal participation. The shift also reflects broader economic transformations in South Africa. As formal employment has declined and informal economic activity has expanded, gangs have positioned themselves to tax and control that informal sector. Street vendors, informal traders, and service providers operating outside formal regulation become targets for protection rackets and tribute demands. The gang extracts value from economic activities that the state doesn't tax or regulate, filling a governance void with predatory extraction. George Thomas's story is often framed as the tale of a criminal who was finally brought to justice through innovative legal tools and persistent prosecution. The 2015 conviction was certainly a legal success, demonstrating that POCA could be used to hold gang leaders accountable for the crimes they ordered, rather than just the crimes they committed personally. The trial proved that prosecutors could build cases against figures who operated through layers of insulation, using racketeering charges to pierce the corporate veil that protected gang leadership. But the 2022 Territorial judgment revealed that the conviction hadn't dismantled the structural capture of provincial security institutions. The infiltration of SAP's senior management in the Western Cape persisted after Thomas's sentencing. The 28s didn't collapse when their general was locked away. They adapted, using the police intelligence and resources they'd already compromised to continue operations while insulating new leaders from the kind of prosecution that had put Thomas away. This suggests that the problem isn't individual gang bosses who can be removed through trials and sentences. The problem is institutional capture that allows criminal organizations to embed themselves in the mechanisms of law enforcement and correctional services. Thomas's conviction removed one particularly effective leader, but it didn't address the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed him to operate from solitary confinement in the first place. The ongoing Independent Police Investigative Directorate investigation into the extent of 28's infiltration has confirmed that probes continue, but details remain scarce. IPID's mandate includes investigating corruption and misconduct within police services, but its effectiveness depends on resources and political support that aren't always forthcoming. Investigations that threaten senior officers or reveal systemic corruption face institutional resistance from the very organizations being investigated. The reluctance to release comprehensive findings fuels suspicion that the corruption runs deeper than officials are willing to acknowledge publicly. Every delayed report and withheld document reinforces the perception that elements of the state remain compromised. Communities that have lost faith in police legitimacy see the delays as confirmation that nothing fundamental has changed, that the reforms being promised are cosmetic rather than structural. The problem extends beyond police corruption into the correctional system. Thomas's ability to issue orders from solitary confinement demonstrated that prisons aren't secure facilities that isolate dangerous criminals. They're nodes in criminal networks, places where gang hierarchies are maintained and where new members are recruited and indoctrinated. Guards who should be preventing criminal activity instead facilitated, either through corruption or through fear of retaliation. Reforming these institutions requires more than prosecuting individual corrupt officers or guards. It requires systemic changes to how personnel are recruited, trained, and supervised. It requires creating accountability mechanisms that can detect corruption before it becomes entrenched. And it requires political will to confront powerful interests that benefit from the status quo, including senior officials who have built careers by accommodating rather than confronting gang influence. The numbers gang didn't create the conditions that sustain it. Those conditions were engineered through policies like the Group Areas Act, which deliberately concentrated poverty, unemployment, and social dislocation in specific geographic zones. The Cape Flats became a spatial mismatch where high population density met low economic opportunity, creating recruitment pools for organizations that offered identity, income, and protection in the absence of state services. The forced removals that created the Cape Flats stripped colored communities of property, economic networks, and social capital that had been accumulated over generations. Families that had owned homes and businesses in central Cape Town were relocated to townships where neither property rights nor economic infrastructure existed. The trauma of displacement combined with the loss of economic opportunity to create conditions where gang membership became a rational response to structural exclusion. Until those underlying conditions change, the removal of individual leaders like George Thomas won't eliminate the organizational structures they command. New generals will rise, new networks will form, the rituals and codes of the numbers gang will be passed to new initiates who see the gang as a more reliable source of stability than legitimate employment or government assistance. This isn't a justification for gang activity. It's a recognition that criminal organizations don't exist in a vacuum. They respond to and exploit the failures of formal institutions. The methamphetamine epidemic in the Western Cape, the collapse of rail infrastructure, the inadequacy of witness protection, the corruption of police management, these aren't separate problems that happen to intersect with gang activity. They're interconnected failures that create space for organizations like the 28s to operate as shadow governments. Addressing one without addressing the others leaves the fundamental ecosystem intact. Education systems in the Cape Flats struggle with overcrowding, under-resourcing, and violence that makes schools feel less safe than gang-controlled streets. Young people leave school without qualifications that would give them access to formal employment, entering a labor market where unemployment rates for youth exceed 50% in some townships. The gang offers an alternative pathway to income and status, one that doesn't require educational credentials or patience with bureaucratic processes. Healthcare infrastructure in gang-controlled areas is similarly strained. Clinics operate with limited staff and supplies, unable to address the addiction and mental health crises that the drug trade has created. Families dealing with addiction have few resources beyond their own networks, and those networks are often compromised by the same economic pressures that make gang involvement attractive. The cycle reinforces itself across generations, with children growing up in households where gang membership is normalized and legitimate alternatives seem unreachable. 7 life sentences plus 175 years should mean that George Thomas will never walk free. But the sentence doesn't erase his impact on the institutional landscape of the Western Cape. The 28s moved from the margins of prison cells to the heart of provincial governance, not because Thomas was uniquely brilliant or ruthless, but because the systems designed to contain and prosecute him were already compromised when he rose to power. The attempted 2024 transfer back to Helderstrom demonstrated that Thomas remains a figure whose movements require ministerial intervention nearly a decade after his conviction. His continued presence in the correctional system forces ongoing decisions about placement, communication restrictions, and monitoring. Each decision carries risk. Isolate him too effectively, and he becomes a martyr whose legend grows in absence. Fail to isolate him, and he continues to command operations through corrupted channels. The confusion sometimes found in databases between George Geweld Thomas and George Thomas of Knoxville, Tennessee, a separate perpetrator involved in the 2007 murders of Channing Christian and Christopher Newsom, illustrates how easy it is for identities to blur when research relies on automated systems. The two men have nothing in common beyond a shared name and violent criminal records. The South African Thomas is defined entirely by his role in the 28s and the Cape Flats underworld. The American Thomas was convicted in an unrelated carjacking and kidnapping case. Maintaining that distinction matters for accuracy, but it also underscores how violence becomes cataloged and categorized across different contexts without necessarily illuminating the systems that produce it. Thomas's legacy isn't just the murders he ordered or the territory he controlled, it's the institutional corruption he exposed and exploited. The 28s didn't capture provincial police management because Thomas was a criminal genius. They captured it because the institutions were vulnerable to capture, riddled with personnel who prioritized self-interest over public service and operating under political oversight that was either ineffective or complicit. The gang's persistence after Thomas's conviction demonstrates organizational resilience that goes beyond individual leadership. The rituals and codes that govern the numbers gang have been refined over more than a century, adapting to changing prison systems, evolving criminal markets, and shifting political contexts. Each generation of gang members inherits those traditions and passes them forward, ensuring continuity even as specific leaders are removed through death or incarceration. The 2015 trial answered whether George Thomas could be held legally responsible for murders he ordered from solitary confinement. The answer was yes. The 2022 judgment answered whether his organization had successfully captured elements of provincial law enforcement. Again, the answer was yes. But one question persists without a clear answer. Has the removal of Thomas from his Cape Flats power base weakened the 28s, or has it simply forced the organization to evolve into something more diffuse and harder to target? The evidence points in both directions. Thomas's physical isolation in Pretoria has clearly disrupted his ability to manage day-to-day operations in the Western Cape. Distance matters when maintaining command over networks that depend on personal loyalty and ritual hierarchy. The general who can't meet with his lieutenants, who can't participate in gang rituals, who can't demonstrate his authority through physical presence, loses some of the mystique and practical control that made him effective. But the gang's survival of his incarceration, its continued infiltration of police management, and its expansion into new economic sectors suggest an organization that isn't dependent on any single leader, no matter how legendary his reputation. The Numbers Gang has existed for more than a century, outlasting countless attempts at suppression and reform. It has absorbed generations of members, each one inducted into a system of codes and rituals that provide continuity across decades. Thomas's rank as general gave him authority within that system, but the system itself doesn't require him to function. New generals can be elevated. New lieutenants can take operational control. The structure persists because it serves a function that formal institutions have failed to provide for the communities it recruits from. Until that functional gap closes, until the state can offer protection, employment, and identity more reliably than the gang, the organization will continue regenerating regardless of which individuals occupy leadership positions. The institutional capture revealed in the Thulare judgment suggests that the 28s have moved beyond the traditional model of a criminal organization that operates in opposition to the state. They've become embedded within state institutions, using police resources and intelligence to advance gang interests while protecting gang operations from enforcement. This represents a qualitative shift that makes the organization harder to combat. When the gang is inside the police service, standard law enforcement approaches become compromised before they're even implemented. George Thomas sits in a prison cell in Pretoria, hundreds of kilometers from the townships where his orders once determined who lived and who died. The sentence he received was among the harshest ever handed down in a South African court, a legal victory that demonstrated the state's capacity to prosecute gang leaders using organized crime legislation. But severity of punishment and effectiveness of justice aren't the same thing. The trial proved that the state could convict a gang general using PAUCA legislation. It didn't prove that convicting gang generals dismantles the organizations they lead or the institutional capture that allows those organizations to thrive. The 28s adapted to Thomas's absence the same way they've adapted to every other challenge over their century-long existence, by maintaining the rituals and structures that outlast individual leaders. The real test wasn't whether the courts could lock Thomas away. It was whether the state could reclaim the institutions he'd helped corrupt, whether police management could be purged of gang influence, whether prisons could actually isolate dangerous criminals instead of serving as command posts for ongoing criminal operations. That test continues in police stations and prisons and townships across the Western Cape without a clear outcome in sight. The broader question is whether institutional reform can ever outpace institutional decay in a context where poverty, unemployment, and social fragmentation create constant demand for the alternative governance that gangs provide. Thomas's conviction removed one particularly effective leader. But the Cape Flats remain what they were when Thomas first rose to power. Zones of concentrated disadvantage where the gang offers pathways that legitimate institutions don't. Until that changes, the next general is already being shaped by the same forces that created Thomas. The cycle will continue, not because South Africans are uniquely criminal or because the Numbers Gang possesses some mystical permanence, but because the structural conditions that produce gang power remain unaddressed. Thomas's end marked the conclusion of one chapter in a much longer story, one that won't conclude until the state can provide what gangs currently supply: protection, income, and belonging in spaces it has historically abandoned.